Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a question?
I'll be glad to yield.
May I inquire as to whether or not this hearing is being covered on one of the C-SPAN channels?
You mean one of the internal House channels?
No, one of the broadcast channels so people could, and we've got an incredible panel of witnesses. And
it is not being covered, but that is not our decision. That's a decision that's made by C-SPAN or by the internal House.
But none of your gripping hearings have been covered on any broadcast television. I think that's a mistake. Just to watch the body language of Lord Monckton while Mr. Waskow was testifying, and vice versa, I think would have been worth the price of admission for our C-SPAN audience.
I'm kidding.
And I regret that my constituents aren't able to tune in.
Now, I'm with you. We don't have to go to Piccadilly. Piccadilly comes to us, and I'm very, honored that we have all these people. But again, it's not within our control, okay? The cameras are there. They are working. If anyone wants to pick it up, it's their decision, not our decision at all. And for my purpose, we're better off having this full discussion. I would have wanted everyone to have just heard Bishop Holloway tell us what our moral obligations are. But it's not my decision.
Well, just for the record, Mr. Chairman, you're infinitely more interesting than a budgetary hearing. And I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, I think. The chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. I'm going to go to you, Dr. Karl, and relate back to Lord Monckton. Could you tell me, based upon 150 years of data from the World Meteorological Association and extensive analysis of public data by governments around the world, including the United States government, is the Earth cooling in the long term, or is it warming as a result of human activity?
I can make this answer very, very short, Chairman. There's no question the Earth is warming. Out of the last 14 years, 13 of them have been the warmest in our recorded history in terms of
Can you say that again, please?
Of the last 14 years, 13 have been the warmest on record in our observed climate record.
Okay, so when Lord Monckton goes back to 1998, and he says, since then we've been on a cooling trend, is it a little bit like saying, well, Babe Ruth, when he started hitting his home runs, there had never been any more than 20. And when he hit 60 in 1927, there was a decline after that. Looking, of course, at Hank Greenberg's 58, Hack Wilson's 56, Jimmy Foxx's 58. And so there was kind of a downward trend because no one could quite match Babe Ruth. On the other hand, Babe Ruth had just completely eclipsed anything that had existed before then. Isn't that a little bit like what Lord Monckton is doing here in saying there's been a decline from 1998 without reflecting upon the fact that, as you pointed out, can you give me that number again?
Of the last 14 years, 13 have been the warmest on record going back to...
The warmest on record, thank you. So there's a little bit of disingenuousness in Lord Monckton's testimony, and I think that the incompleteness historically in his testimony is something that doesn't serve the committee really that well, because it's these longer-term trends that are at much higher levels by a significant amount in terms of their warming impact that is of great concern, and why the United Nations put together that group of 3,000 scientists to reflect upon that and to make recommendations to the world and to the United States. Mr. Schweiger, could you reflect upon what Mr. Kyle just pointed out?
One of the ways to think about this is to think about what's happening to the Earth. And if you look at what's going on in the Arctic region, the melt of the Arctic is setting all sorts of new records. The thing that concerns me most is this carbon storage that we find in the Arctic region is now being given off at I think, quite significant rates. The leakage of methane. The boreal forests in Canada, for example, are going to be giving off more carbon in the next 10 years than they're going to be storing. 9 of the next 10 years are going to be net producers of carbon. So as the Earth warms, it begins to behave in ways that are very troubling. And I would suggest to us that we're in a second phase of global warming, that phase where humans are not only contributing, but we're now seeing nature giving back some of its carbon stores. And I would ask the committee to pay close attention to that.
Thank you, Mr. Schweiger, very much. Dr. Carl, in the legislation I introduced last year, it established the National Climate Service. Does the administrator of NOAA support a climate service, and could you distinguish between what a weather service and a climate service would provide in terms of information for ourselves and for the rest of the world?
Yes, in fact, Administrator Lubchenco has made it clear during her testimony for her confirmation hearing that she does support the development of a national climate service, similar scope as compared to a national weather service. The differences between a climate service and a weather service is that a climate service would be focusing on aspects of climate change mitigation and adaptation, as we're discussing here today, delivering products and services in that respect. I've often been asked the question about, well, would the weather service and climate service, would there be a demarcation between what time scale a weather service addresses and a climate service addresses? And I think the way to think about this is that obviously a weather service is going to continue to protect us, get us out of harm's way, protect life and property, forecasting the kind of weather events that occur on a near real-time basis. But as Congressman Baldwin pointed out, when we have floods like we had last year, we want to be able to better understand whether there are anthropogenic influences that may be causing such floods, and so a climate service would want to be there helping to explain those conditions. Intense and severe hurricane seasons, are there contributions that humans may be adding to those kinds of events? So that is best I can do in terms of helping to describe the differences.
Thank you, Dr. Cowell, very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Lord Bunkton wanted to have a say in that first question that you posed. So, Lord Bunkton?
Certainly, sir. Yes, I do. If you want it put in perspective, let's put it in perspective. Let's go back 600 million years to the Cambrian era. Oh, yes, I remember it well.
Now, just for the record, that is, I think, is when the Chicago Cubs last won the title. So it's okay. I don't know if you know baseball as well.
I'll ride with that. Certainly, 600 million years ago, there was about 20 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there is today. And global temperature was about 12.5 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than today. That's how much extra carbon dioxide you have to put in the atmosphere to get that kind of increase. And for most of the last 600 million years, it has been around 12.5 degrees warmer than today, Fahrenheit. However, if we come more recently to the last 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, for most of the last 10,000 years, it has been around 4 or 5 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than today. Most recently in the Minoan and Roman and medieval warm periods, it was warmer than today. There was then a period of considerable cooling. Indeed, the sun between 1645 and 1715 was at its lowest level of activity in 10,000 years, according to sunspot records. Now, thereafter, the sun's activity gradually increased until in the last 70 years of the 20th century, it reached what is known to solar physicists as a solar grand maximum. That coincided with a considerable period of warming. However, the warming period of 1975 to 1998, when it stopped, there was no greater warming rate then than there was between 1860 and 1880, and again between 1910 and 1940. There is therefore no anthropogenic signal whatsoever in the temperature record so far. The IPCC has predicted global warming, and yet for the last 7 years there has been global cooling. Now, that global cooling is, of course, a consequence of natural variability, just as very nearly all of the global warming of the 300 years that preceded it is, on any view, also attributable to natural climate variability. There is therefore nothing in the temperature record that should give us any cause of concern to date.
Thank you. Mr. Carl, I regret that I didn't bring this publication, but I read a story just this week. It was made public. The Chinese apparently had indicated that they had not, they did not have any more recent data than, I believe, 1994 in terms of specific emissions within their country. And I think South America, was it Brazil? Was it Brazil? Was close to the same. How do we actually monitor what other nations are doing? One of the concerns that a good number of us have is if we imposed a cap-and-trade scheme, that particularly countries like China and India would welcome that, because they would see that job growth be exported from the U.S. To those countries. And as we've seen with China building a new coal plant, literally 2 every single week, how is it that we're going to actually be able to monitor the emissions from those nations when, in fact, they're, at least as we saw this week, putting up their hands and saying it's not any of your business? What type of tools do we have?
Yeah, right now NOAA has something called the Carbon Tracker Program. You can actually go on the web and take a look at our best estimates as how carbon is being moved around the world, and this is actually into the atmosphere. We actually have observatories in North Pole, Barrow, and several other locations. We've got a global monitoring network. We collect flash samples from across the world to try and measure atmospheric concentrations. This kind of information is used in models, and there's some technical methods that are used to try and go back to the sources when we actually measure the amount of carbon in the atmosphere so we can better understand where they're actually being emitted and being absorbed. It's an area in which NOAA is very interested in to continue to improve our capabilities here, and we've actually put forth a number of proposals.
Did you see the report that was put out this week by the Chinese?
No, I have not.
We'll get it, and I'd like you to maybe comment in writing. We'll get it to you and do that. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan. Have an obstructed view seat here. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dingell, if you could. Great, thank you.
Last year, Mr. Boucher and I introduced released a draft in which we addressed the question of using some of the resources generated by the cap and trade to see to it that we could use these allowances for safeguarding fish, wildlife, natural resources from the impacts of climate change. We also had the intention of seeing to it that we would preserve wetlands, marshes, mountains, forests, grasslands, and things of that kind. Have you seen that draft?
Yes, I have, sir, and I wanted to thank both of you for that sponsorship.
Do you support it?
We do support that.
National Wildlife does?
And a number of other organizations that are signed on to our statement also support that effort. We believe that it's important to take some of the revenues that are generated from a cap and invest program and apply them to protecting these vital resources. The number that was in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee last year is a good number, I think, to start with for efforts going forward. But we clearly think that wildlife need funding, that adaptation needs to be implemented. There are plans that are beginning to be developed. Much more needs to be done across the entire country, and in fact.
Would you equate this with adaptation, the language that Mr. Boucher and I have released? Would you equate that with adaptation in a good form?
Absolutely.
Very good. Given the extensive conservation investments that we have made in the Congress, going back to Pittman, Robertson, Dingell, Johnson, and all the other programs of this kind, how much risk is there that these investments could be squandered if we fail to invest now in natural resource adaptation?
One example of the risk that we face, there was a recent assessment of the national wildlife refuges, and over 60% of those refuges that were studied will be out of their biome if we continue to on the course that we're on today. So what that means is the natural diversity that existed on those refuges will no longer be able to survive in the warming climate in those locations. So there's a great urgency to help in that transition.
Thank you. Now, going across, starting with you, Bishop Holloway, if you please. Do you support the idea of adaptation? Absolutely. Next witness, do you? Yes or no?
Yes.
Next witness, please.
Sir, if you must do anything, then adapt. That's what we've been doing since we were created. I'm sure we'll continue just fine, and we probably don't need Congress to help us.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, adaptation is the natural human action in response to all changes around us. We have done that for thousands of years, and I think we will continue to do that very well, with or without central planning.
Does that mean yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Schweiger, I believe you've already been next witness.
Yes.
Final witness, sir.
Yes, and if I could just add, if I may, one of the real challenges for adaptation will be for us to be able to provide the kinds of climate-related information that will be necessary, because the climate will be constantly evolving and changing, and developing those information transfers between what we understand the science and the engineering practices that are so important to put in place for adaptation. There will be a key linkage that I think we will have to ensure that we do a better job in developing.
Thank you. Now, I have another question here for you, sir. I am curious, and I want you, with your expertise as of a member of the GAO, how are we're going to generate enormous sums of money from the sale of these allowances. How are we going to keep those sales honest? We are obviously going to have lots of inspector generals. We are obviously going to have lots and lots of responsibilities imposed upon these people. We're obviously going to have questions with regard to how we handle the accounting. Can you give me a quick and dirty answer as to how we're going to address this problem of keeping honest men, or maybe somewhat dishonest men, honest, given the huge temptations we're going to lay before them?
Well, this is part of the details of the cap and trade program, and whether or not you use offsets or not as a cost containment mechanism. Both of those features require emissions, not certainty, but certainly good estimating techniques and verification techniques to ensure that the baseline emissions are correct. Then we're proponents of an auction rather than allocation of the allowances to make sure that the price of carbon is set correctly. We think carbon offsets is a form of cost containment, but it too has a lot of problems in verifying that the additional carbon offsets you would get would be additional. That means that would not have occurred anyway. So the devil's in the details for all of this legislation. There is much to do to determine what techniques should be used to estimate allowances, to verify allowances, and to manage a cap and trade program if that's the way we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You were very generous.
Mr. Barton of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all of our witnesses. I really appreciate you all being here. I'm going to focus on two of our witnesses, Mr. Carl and Lord Monckton, on some of the science. Mr. Carl, you are a climatologist, is that not correct?
That's correct.
And you are part of the scientific panel of the IPCC.
I was lead author and convening lead author on the first 3 IPCC reports and a review editor on the last.
So we could consider you an expert. You wouldn't disavow that descriptive.
You could consider me anything you like, sir.
Well, I think you're an expert. Now, Lord Monckton presented the committee 3 charts One is a chart from the Hadley and NCDC monthly terrestrial global temperature data set and the RSS and UAH satellite lower troposphere data sets that shows a global cooling over the last 7 years of about, if I read it correctly, equivalent to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit a century. Is he lying to us?
Well, that's a very unusual way of presenting data that has never in the IPCC been combined in that way. And let me give you an example why.
But I mean, is the data that he presents the factual?
I can't attest to the figure you showed on the figure so quickly. I looked at it for
Will
3
you
seconds.
do that? Will you research it and send a report to the committee whether he's lying to us or telling us the truth?
I certainly will. I can tell you that when IPCC does detection and attribution studies, one of the key issues that we look at is the change in the rate of temperature throughout the atmosphere, and that figure actually averaged temperatures at the surface with temperatures throughout the troposphere, which is not the way we go about doing fingerprint attribution. So that was quite unusual when I noticed that right off.
Okay, but it is theoretically possible he's telling the truth, or this chart is factually correct.
I'll reserve judgment when you send it to me, and we'll take a look at it.
And give us an honest assessment.
Best we can do.
Now, his other chart shows that the headline is the UN exaggerates the greenhouse effect by 7-fold. Are you familiar with that graph? And is that another case of creative graphing, or is that the truth?
If I remember, this is the figure that was showing the rates of carbon emissions. Is that
14 years of model predicted black and ERBE satellite observed red change in outgoing long-wave radiation from the Earth's surface?
Yeah, in fact, last week, Chairman Mullihan's committee had a hearing on climate data records. And that graph, one of the important aspects of when you show Earth radiation budget data, you have to take into account the fact that these measurements are made from satellites that change their orbit over time and from different satellites. And one has to stitch together the climate record from those satellites.
Well, can you look at this one also?
Yeah, it's incorrect. I can tell you off right away.
You just say this one's wrong.
I can, because I saw that immediately. That is incorrect because it hasn't
and
taken.
What about his last chart that shows CO2 concentrations are rising below the prediction that the IPCC keeps saying these huge increases are going to in CO2, and it just doesn't appear that factually that can be verified by actual data collection. What's the story about that?
Yeah, we actually, I was quite surprised to see that graph because right now there's a unified synthesis product the Climate Change Science Program has put together, and it's just gone through its second round of public review comments, and we hope to have it cleared through the agencies, the Climate Change Science Program agencies, in the next few months. But if you look at that document today, there's actually a graph in there showing the rates of emissions over the past 15 years. And if you look around, compared to IPCC scenarios...
I'm about to run out of time, and I want to give Dr. Monckton, or Lord Monckton, a chance to...
The bottom line is what our concern is the rates of global emissions are faster than what some of the IPCC emission scenarios suggest today.
Lord Monckton, he basically says you're a liar. What's your...
Well, of course, if you concentrate on emissions, then he's right. Emissions are rising faster than the IPCC predicted because they didn't expect China to do what China said she would do and continue to build power stations at a rate of 1 a week burning coal. However, concentration remaining in the atmosphere has indeed fallen, and the reason why is that it hasn't fallen, but it's gone up much slower than the emissions have and much below what is forecast. And the reason why that is that as the UN itself admits in its documents, it is incapable of adding up what's called the carbon budget in and out of the atmosphere to within a factor of 2 of the right answer.
Well, Lord, just as I've asked Mr. Carl to try to verify what he said for the committee's consideration, could you also attempt to give some supporting documentation to prove that your charts are accurate and factually based.
Certainly, I'll be happy to supply a paper which is currently out for peer review, which explains exactly how these two graphs are compiled. The third graph is from a scientific paper, one of a series that's appeared in the literature on this question of the outgoing long-wave radiation not diminishing as fast as the UN's models predicted it would, and I will give you the references to various papers on that subject.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Lord. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The lady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to shift a while here to get to from the global level to so-called ground level in my community. Millions of people in my state depend upon levees to protect them, and climate change will increase the state's flood risk by causing a shift toward more intense winter storms, which could produce higher peak flows. Flood systems throughout the state must be upgraded and managed to accommodate the higher variability of flood flows to protect public safety, the economy, and ecosystems. And this is not cheap. In 2007, Sacramento property owners voted to assess themselves almost $300 million for their local match to help achieve 200-year flood protection in the Sacramento area. Shortly thereafter, the state legislature passed legislation authorizing the state to participate in the 200-year flood protection program and contribute 70% of the non-federal costs of the program. In 2008, our flood control agency established a development fee program to add to the local funding available for the 200-year program. Now, Mr. Schwager, as you can see, my community has taken upon themselves to be leaders in adaptation and water management. However, Sacramento's risk of flooding remains high, and we need additional help. In your testimony, you referenced a lot of communities and their efforts to adapt. What are other communities doing to help prevent flooding, and how are they raising the necessary funding?
A number of groups are working. I'll give you one example in coastal Louisiana to reestablish some of the damaged wetland systems in the New Orleans area, because we believe that by building back this natural resistance, we will reduce the storm surges and will also provide protection for nearby communities. So we think that there's an important investment in that area. I would also suggest that the Army Corps of Engineers needs to change the way they do their planning and look forward and not look backwards. You know, we've been designing structures to look at the last 100 years, and I think it's important that Congress give the Corps direction to look forward and understand the modeling and how it might impact communities. I think that there are many community risk involved in climate change, and there are also enormous wildlife risk. Some of your fishery resources, for example, in California are being lost as coastal areas are being lost due to sea level rise, and important wetland systems are disappearing.
And in your opinion, what percentage should the federal government contribute to adaptation versus states and communities? And, you know, we're looking for financing. What are the types of financing should we look to in tough economic times?
The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee last year had identified a $7 billion annual average funding for the first 2 decades for the climate adaptation funding for wildlife. And if you look at that, that's about 1% of the economic benefits from outdoor recreation, forest and wetland conservation. So we think that's a reasonable starting point for those kinds of investments. And I should say that there's also a number of other important community investments that need to be made, and some of those are in fact overlapping, because what benefits humans also benefit wildlife in certain cases.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stevenson, I understand the GAO is still analyzing adaptation efforts as you complete your study this year. Based on what you have uncovered, have you seen examples of adaptation efforts relating to flood control?
Yeah, the one I mentioned in Maryland, we just visited the state of Maryland and are looking at their efforts to address sea level rise. And at this point, it's more one of providing information to counties subject to sea level rise and advising what they can do in their laws and their land management use plans to address those problems.
So
But
what,
they're going to have to make economic decisions in the future as to what kind of adaptive measures they may want to take.
what is the federal government doing to better understand the flood risk and hydrologic impacts of a changing planet?
Well, there are many research efforts, both by the federal government and others, both in the U.S. and throughout the world, on this issue. What we're suggesting is that there needs to be more regional and localized information so that individual communities and governments can make decisions on what they should or shouldn't do. But we don't think the information is specific enough to the local level to be able to make those decisions.
And what should Congress specifically do to finance flood control efforts as they relate to climate change?
Well, we haven't really looked at that issue. We did look at the national, federal flood insurance program, and we think it's interesting that there have been no portfolio adjustments on the federal government's part for the insurance industry, similar to what Swiss Re and some of the big reinsurers of the world have already done. They've already looked at climate change projections and adjusted their portfolios to minimize their risk, and we're suggesting that the federal government should do the same thing both for crop insurance and flood insurance.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord...
I'm sorry, excuse me. You sure? I'm sorry.
Lord Monckton, you say the European try at cap and trade has failed. Would you elaborate, and why do you suggest the U.S. may go it alone?
Certainly. You'll go it alone, I think, to answer that question first, because those who have tried cap and trade have found it doesn't work. Those who are thinking of trying it are, in the light of that, beginning to revise their opinions on whether they should. There are many problems with cap and trade, but to answer your question about the European experience in particular, the European Union, which is governed by effectively a bureaucratic centralist dictatorship in Brussels, decided to allocate to each member state a right to emit without payment, which exceeded each state's total emissions. Not surprisingly, therefore, the price of the right to emit carbon per tonne fell to the market clearing level of 0 on the artificial carbon trading hot air market. It's called the trading in hot air on the London market in recognition of its general uselessness. So it failed, and they therefore decided that they would issue an edict that each country was not allowed to give away as many free permits as before. However, the economic collapse then supervened, and when you have a declining economy, then what happens is whatever price you try to set for carbon will promptly fall on the open market, and we're now once again trading carbon permits at dangerously close to 0. So for the second time, the European system has failed in much the same way as the New Zealand system has also failed. And in Australia, where they had been contemplating carbon trading, the Senate, much as here, has decided that it doesn't like the idea. So if you do impose carbon trading, then you could be shooting yourselves uniquely in the foot, because most other countries of the world are at present disinclined to follow you.
And whom do you believe will be most affected by cap and trade or a carbon tax or any other method of increasing energy prices?
That's an extremely good question, and the answer is unfortunately horrifyingly clear. It is low-income families. It is the poor. Why? Because a larger proportion of their income is devoted to spending on energy than any other sector. Now, of course, there may or will indeed be elaborate attempts to make transfer payments to the poor to try to cushion them to some extent or even fully from the effects of this misguided type of taxation. But unfortunately, that then leaves the cost of it falling disproportionately on the middle class because, as you may know, President Obama has recently given strong indications to the other people who are most heavily affected by cap and trade. That's very big, heavily emitting industries, of course, electricity generation, steel, concrete, construction, so forth. They would have suffered very badly by this, and President Obama has said he's going to look favorably on exempting them to some degree. If he does that, then the entire cost of a tax which is supposed to bring in very nearly the equivalent of the entire federal budget on average for the last 5 years, and it will bring it in every year for the next 8 years, $2 trillion a year, that is going to fall entirely on small businesses who are already disproportionately affected by the existing recession. If that happens, there will be bankruptcies all round, and it is even possible that this scheme, as at present conceived, and I must make this point very clear to you, could bankrupt the United States government itself.
Dr. Beisner, you criticize the promotion of solar panels and renewable energy in the developing world. Why do you believe this is not in the best interest of the poor?
Well, the developed world managed to do a great deal of its economic growth on the basis of the very inexpensive energy that was available to us by the development of grids and the like. Just recently, Amity Shlaes' book, The Forgotten Man, was published, A History of the Great Depression. She discusses the competition between the idea that there should be small local generating plants, indeed even possibly generators at every home, versus the idea of grids. And essentially what we're being asked to do when we say, let's have the small alternative energy things for people's huts and so on in Africa, is to choose what they figured out even at the time of the 1920s and 1930s was not going to work here. It's a short-term, really illusory solution that has long-term costs by directing capital investment away from the types of generation and distribution of electricity that can reach the lowest cost per kilowatt hour delivered in the longer term. And so what we're actually doing is asking the poor to adapt fairly expensive short-term solutions in exchange for much cheaper long-term solutions for their energy needs.
So what do we do? What's the best approach to help developing nations take to help world's poor and impoverished?
Well, as Bjorn Lomborg and the Copenhagen Consensus have pointed out, certainly one of the most important things that we can do is to promote the Doha round and world trade generally, because general world trade is the most important thing for raising income levels, and as income levels rise, those can generate enough capital investment to support the provision of large-scale energy systems to electrify the homes of the roughly 2.6 billion people around the world who don't have them. Rather than highly centralized governmental solutions, I think the market solutions are the best. And that's what we learn from the history of economics.
My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Capps, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. I agree with my colleague who said this is quite a stellar panel and very interesting. I thank all the witnesses, and I want to thank especially and associate myself with the remarks of Bishop Holloway, since you represent my faith tradition. And I feel I must make a brief disclaimer to you, Lord Monckton. I am privileged to represent a congressional district in California which stretches a bit over 200 miles of coastline. And I want to reassure you that my neighbors and I have no intention of packing up and leaving anytime soon. But
I'm delighted.
Thank you. Mr. Swiger, as I mentioned, my congressional district lies entirely within California's coastal zone. We must plan for sea rise. And then in that regard, I suppose I could represent any community along the coastal areas of our nation and perhaps even indeed of the world. It's been said in my area, if we bury our heads in the sand on the issue of sea rising, we may drown. Could you give some specific strategies that managers, federally, locally, and other kinds of interveners could manage to help our communities to be more resilient in the face of climate change? How might we, or should we, change some of our approaches to the management of coastal areas?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think the first thing we need to do is actually to cap pollution, because the most important thing we can do is quit feeding the beast that's raising the sea levels and warming our planet. Secondly, I think it's important for us to do really good downscaling of the models that are currently being used to assess the condition of our planet. And I would say the greater granularity we can get into those models, the more we can know exactly what we're dealing with locally. And I think it's important as we plan those futures that we anticipate the range of sea level rise, and that goes for water supplies, sewage and stormwater management. I think it also speaks to the design of culverts and all the other things that we do in community. We need to understand that we're going to have more vigorous rainstorms. Coastal flooding is going to be more intense in many places. But I think it's so important to get that downscaling right so that we know precisely the kind of choices we need to make for both humans and nature.
Thank you. And Mr. Carl, this is what your agency does. I don't have time to ask you, but I'm certainly very interested in working with the NOAA as we design this granularity to be specific to our communities. And you have people in my district that I'm very grateful for, and I look forward to that partnership. I want to turn the rest of my time to the comments that were made by Mr. Waskow and Bishop Holloway. You made the statement, Mr. Waskow, that it probably will cost upwards of $50 billion to address adaptation needs. And it has been alluded to that, like the wildlife and the marine life, whose creatures are most impacted by climate change and are not really responsible for it nor in a position to really adapt a lot. The poorest of the poor, as the bishop described, are often living in coastal areas. Again, didn't contribute very much to this and will certainly be at the mercy. And there's a moral compulsion, which I hope each of you will address, but there's also a piece of it that I want to get on the record, that it would be in our interest. It's an investment, really, that could be made to assist these communities in adaptation to climate change, because it will can provide their self-empowerment and their ability to decrease their dependency and to increase their self-sufficiency. I'll let you, I don't have much time, but maybe if each of you could say a word to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would fundamentally agree that it is in our national interest to address adaptation needs around the world for several reasons. One is the security dimension that has been alluded to already. A second has to do with costs that we would face from responding to disasters. So, for example, helping provide irrigation equipment, improved agricultural practices, drought and water-resistant seeds, those kind of things help in reducing the risk of famine or other food crises. Similarly, helping communities improve and strengthen their infrastructure, their roads, their bridges, their schools, their clinics, helps in reducing potential disaster response costs down the road. And
I don't want to, I know you could say more, but I want to ask the chairman's indulgence if I could ask my bishop to make one word on this. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
I look at this in a three-tiered way, that in our work of dealing with the issues and problems of many different people around the world, I see that one pillar must be emergency and immediate aid. That's incumbent upon us. The other is where we can to work as in an accompaniment model. Rather than telling folks what to do, we work with them to see what we can jointly discover as the best way to build capacity, the capacity that might lead toward self-sufficiency. And the third thing is advocacy. Now, for those who do not have a voice, but who have just as much a stake in the quality of life as anyone else. So these are the three areas I think that we're most effective, and look for legislation here, since we are for lack of a better term, the biggest dog in the pound. So we have a higher responsibility since we have higher resource.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to have the panel. Apologize for being in and out. That's kind of our line of work. Let me ask a question. When we've had these debates in the previous year, we used to talk about the off-ramp. It's not being talked about very much now. And the basic premise was, if China and India do nothing, all our pain and agony is for no results. Should there be an off-ramp in legislation on climate change? And just say kind of yes or no, maybe a little phrase so I can get my time in. Bishop Holloway?
I don't believe so, sir.
Okay.
And,
if it can be quickly.
Okay, yes, that's impossible.
Why is it impossible?
Because ministers cannot speak briefly.
Oh. I thought it's impossible because China and India will never agree to any cap on carbon. And so to assume that China and India will be involved in any regime to control climate, that's the impossibility. Mr. Wasco?
We have the greatest historical responsibility for emissions. We have to take the lead, and I think that by taking the lead, we will be most able to bring others like China and India along.
Okay. Lord Monckton.
None of the disasters imagined by this committee will happen. Sea level in particular is not about to rise by more than around 8 inches to a foot this century. Even the UN says only 1.5 feet, maximum 2. That's not going to do any damage except in places where the land is subsiding for non-climate change reasons. The Chinese and the Indians are perfectly aware of this. They have declared over and over again, and rightly, that they're not going to do this, and therefore you should indeed have an off-ramp. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beisner.
Yes, we should have an off-ramp for precisely that sort of reason, but also simply because the assumption behind all of this is that the climate change that we're seeing has been human-driven. Climate change and human-driven climate change are not the same thing. And the increasing tendency of the most recent scientific publications has been to magnify the apparent natural contribution and minimize the human contribution.
Mr. Schweiger.
I believe that the Himalayas are at great risk. The Chinese and Indian governments are well aware of those risks. And
Should there be an off-ramp?
I believe what we ought to do is work closely with China, particularly to find common ground to make the reduction.
Should there be an off-ramp?
I do not believe that we should back away from our responsibility.
Should there be an off-ramp?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Stevenson?
We can't control what China does. We have to take action irregardless of what they do, so there should not be an off-ramp.
Thank you. Mr. Carl?
Our agency works to provide the science to help provide that.
You're right. Very good. Give my post to Ryan. We had testimony here. I want to talk to the impact on the middle class and the poor. My district represents 30 counties in rural southern Illinois, stretching from the state capital, Springfield, down to the Paducah, Kentucky, Indiana line. This was a mine, as I said in my opening statement. 1,200 miners lost their jobs. I now know through additional research 4 other mines closed primarily because of the Clean Air Act amendments. The economy of southern Illinois has been devastated through the mine closures. The Coal Association of Ohio testified just last week 36,000 mine workers lost their jobs. This is an incredible impact on the livelihood, and it does fall disproportionately on the poor. They will pay the burden of this through job loss, through long distances, through travels. Lord Monckton, talk to me about this debate on, are we a carbon-starved planet?
Well, Will Happer testified, he's from Princeton, testified in front of the Senate committee with Dr. Pachauri on this recently, and Will Happer's view that yes, we are carbon-starved. If we go back to the Cambrian era, 7,000 parts per million compared with less than 400 parts per million today. Go back to the Triassic era, 175 million years ago, at the time when the aragonite corals, the most fragile of all the corals, came into being by algal symbiosis for the first time. Again, around 6,500 to 7,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a plant food. It's necessary.
Say that again. Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
Yeah. Without it, all plant life, and therefore all life that depends on it,
so if we
would disappear.
decrease the use of carbon dioxide, are we not taking away plant food from the atmosphere?
Yes, indeed you are. The U.S. Forest Service has very good figures showing the enormous growth in the cubic yard.
So all our good intentions could be for vain. In fact, we could be doing just the opposite of what the people who want to save the world are saying.
You could indeed. You're quite right.
And I would just, the basic finish with this comment is, The earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I yield back my time.
Thank you. We have, I believe, 4, maybe 5 more members. We could go with a lightning round of 2-minute apiece and vote, or we could continue and then come back. The chair would suggest we do a lightning round of 2-minute apiece. And I just wonder if anyone would have objections to that.
Vote's going to start here in 30 seconds.
Yeah, vote's going to start just briefly. I would suggest we will. The chair is sacrificing his time in order to move forward. If there's no objection to that, let me suggest that we do
I would object and just make that decision once the time comes for the call of vote.
We will always respect Mr. Shimkis's views, at least on this very small issue. Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for coming here. I think good call. Your testimony is excellent, and I want to congratulate the chairman, Markey, for pulling together this hearing. You know, when we discuss adaptation, I can't help think about my home district in California for 2 reasons. One is by analogy to climate change, and the other is by an already in progress impact of climate change. The first that I want to discuss is earthquakes. California is earthquake country, and we've learned a lot about how to adapt to earthquakes. We build our buildings better, and the results are pretty dramatic. Although we still have a lot to learn and a lot to do to make our cities safer. The second is water. You know, many glaciers are receding around the world, and California depends on its snowpack. So we're deeply engaged in planning and preparing for this, and I think that's an adaptation to global warming. So building buildings better and more resilient and building better waterways is good sense. The threat of global warming is just adds urgency to this whole issue. Mr. Mockton, I have a question. Do you think we should stop planning for earthquakes and stop adapting for water changes, or what should we do in this case?
So, as far as earthquakes are concerned, there is no connection between earthquakes and global warming.
No, but it's adapting to...
you are on. Yes, of course, you should always adapt to natural change.
Should we adapt to water coming down from the Sierras?
Yes, if as California is a very heavy user of water, you will need to make sure there are continuing water supplies.
So adapting to a change in progress is a good idea.
So of course, adaptation to natural changes that occur is very sensible.
Thank you.
If there were any
Mr. Carl,
changes also.
May I ask you, Mr. Carl, could you just give me a little bit of detail about some of the models, the resolution that you have, the accuracy that you have? I'm a scientist, a mathematician, and I did spend a career in modeling, so I'm interested technically in where we are with this stuff.
Yeah, one of the things we can tell you is that the models today are good enough to be able to identify some of the causes for some of the water issues out west with respect to changes in the snowmelt season. Snowmelt, and from the observations, we already see it's melting earlier. More frequently, that runoff occurs more earlier. It means there's less water available later in the summer for use. That kind of an activity, that kind of process is expected to continue and accelerate as global warming continues on into the future. So that's one example from the standpoint of water. Another one has to do with changes in heavy precipitation events. We are seeing a change in the frequency of heavy precipitation.
So you have confidence in the resolution of these models and the accuracy of these models?
Yes.
In a sort of an average sense?
In a broad sense, yes.
Okay. Well, we'll have to talk more about that on a different minute. I'm going to yield back to be courteous to my other...
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carl, in a way, your federal agency is an adaptation, is it not? Isaac Klein, the famed meteorologist in Galveston with the storm that Gene Green mentioned of 106 or 7 years ago. I mean, your federal agency came into existence as a consequence of the troubles that Mr. Klein encountered at that point with not being able to predict what was fixing to happen to them, and of course the large loss of life that then ensued. So in many ways what we're seeing today with your federal agency is an adaptation to the fact that if you develop coastal areas from time to time, you will be visited by hurricanes. Is that not correct?
There's no question.
Now, on the issue of hurricanes, I apologize for not having the data in front of me, but it seems like in a newspaper report from just a few days ago, we have entered into a period of a relative lull in hurricanes. Is that am I correct in that?
All I can tell you is that we have, over the past several decades, seen an increase in hurricane activity. And in fact, the most recent paper looking at all the global oceans have identified fairly conclusively that since the early 80s, the intensity of the strongest storms has actually increased. Now, one has to recognize when it gets down to smaller and smaller scales, because we have fewer hurricanes, it's more difficult to say, for example, yes, we're seeing a change in intensity of storms affecting a particular part of the coastline.
And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the chairman has limited my time. We see cycles. We're in a bad recession right now. We're told that it is equivalent to the Great Depression of the 1930s, but we don't have the adverse weather phenomenon that they encountered in the 1930s in the form of the Dust Bowl. But having moved to the state of Texas as a very, very young child back in the early 50s, I remember very well the 7 years that it didn't rain. As I recall, the newspapers attributed that to the fact that the Russians were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and that was the Russian fallout that was responsible for no rain. I guess our fallout was exempt, but nevertheless, there always seems to be a reason that we will look for when we encounter these odd weather cycles. So how do we know, as we're sitting here and we're going to make policy, significant policy that's going to affect the next 3 generations of Americans, how do we know that we are just simply sitting here observing what are naturally occurring cycles in our climate? What would be the fingerprint? What would be the signature? What's the sine qua non for man-made, for evidence that this is a man-made phenomenon?
That's an excellent question, and I can tell you what NOAA is doing is what we actually do is go back in time and actually simulate in our computers the kinds of conditions that have occurred that actually led to various intensities and frequencies of hurricanes each season. And one of the things I can say with the American Recovery Act, we actually now will have access to supercomputing, petaflop, state-of-the-art computers. We'll be running these models in much higher resolution mode to be able to pinpoint with greater accuracy and greater
understanding. So right now, we just simply do not know. We don't have the data that we are required to have.
We want more. Right now,
and I don't disagree, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I only have a limited amount of time, and Lord Martin.
All I can tell you is that the projections in the future in the models show more intense hurricanes. Right now, the linkage in terms of a specific attribution between what we've seen and intense hurricanes still awaits more scientific study.
Lord Monckton, you were wanting to tell me something.
Yes, sir. You wanted to know what the current state of play is about hurricanes. Over the last 30 years, satellites have been monitoring the frequency and intensity of hurricanes, and an accumulated cyclone energy index is compiled, which is a 2-year running sum of the frequency and intensity of all hurricanes, tropical storms around the equator, and the current value of that accumulated cyclone energy index is the lowest it has been in the 30 years globally that's been recorded. So you're quite right.
You'll make that data available to Mr. Carl to plug into the supercomputer?
I'll give him the graph. It's been published recently.
Wonderful. I look forward to that. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back in the interest of time.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Carl, you're having this debate here about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. A lot of evidence that they're actually rising, and whether they're doing so in line with the projections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. My question is, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere easily determined? I mean, is that really a scientific debate about whether we can measure it? And is it not the case that the level, in fact, is higher than in the past IPCC projections?
Answer your question, it's probably the most confident measurement we can make, and that is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and indeed it is increasing, and it is due to human causes. And related to comparison to IPCC, again, what IPCC uses are scenarios, and there's a number of scenarios they use in terms of how carbon dioxide concentrations would change in the future without any policy options, but with considerations of economic growth, technology intervention. And if you look at those scenarios, the current levels of of carbon dioxide concentration are very consistent with those models. Some, in some respects, might even be a little bit low.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, the committee will be in recess, I think about 12:30. Can the panel all stay with us? Is that acceptable? Thank you for your courtesy. Mr. Schweiger may not be able to, but we appreciate it. We'll be back about 12:30. Thank you.